Formula One rolled out the red carpet for Ford's announcement of its comeback as an engine partner to Red Bull in 2026. And that raised some questions given the somewhat cool reaction Andretti received from F1 when it announced its tie-up with General Motors last month. The Ford deal has been viewed in some quarters as glorified sponsorship masked as an engine supply with no real investment or technological input, and therefore it's not a real manufacturer project. As some were quick to point out, that's quite similar to how General Motors' support of a prospective Andretti Cadillac team has been viewed and has been used as a reason to put down that bid. So is this hypocrisy or a sign of where the real problem lies with Andretti? We'll try to answer that in this video, and as we do, let us know what you think in the comments. First, let's better understand the type of deal Ford has done and why. Ford had discussions with existing and prospective teams about an F1 partnership and considered its own works team. But it says nothing felt right before the Red Bull arrangement emerged as an option. The so-called strategic partnership between Red Bull Powertrains and Ford will bring the US manufacturer back into F1 for the first time since 2004, ironically when it sold Jaguar to, drumroll please, Red Bull. Ford was motivated to find a route onto the F1 grid by F1's growing popularity in the United States and the increased electrification of its engines, so it started the process of working out what to do more than 2 years ago. The company studied a lot of options for a return, but Ford only wanted to do F1 very strategically, according to Ford Performance Director Mark Rushbrook, which we can slightly cynically interpret to mean as cheaply as possible. So it ruled out a works team, it ruled out buying into an existing team or taking one over completely like Audi is doing with Sauber, and it ruled out a full standalone engine project like Honda had in recent years. It was only when Red Bull talks began in the second half of 2022 that a clear preference materialised because it presented a unique opportunity. Red Bull's decision to become an engine manufacturer was sparked by Honda quitting F1, and it meant Red Bull was the only non-automotive company preparing for the 2026 rules. That gave Ford the chance to partner with an organisation that's already tooled up to build an F1 engine, but is not a rival manufacturer in the road car world. As we covered in our video last week when this news broke, Red Bull Powertrains will be the foundation of the project, and Ford is mainly contending it will have technical input on the electrical elements of the engine. It's fair to say this is not an out-and-out Ford in F1 venture, certainly not like when it owned a team or any of its previous projects in conjunction with Cosworth as an engine supplier. But it seems F1 is perfectly happy with such an arrangement, even though it lacks the total commitment of other manufacturers like Ferrari, Mercedes, Renault, and from 2026, Audi. Clearly, some see the Ford deal as paying for the privilege of calling itself an engine supplier and dressing it up as something more. Something that's being held against the recently announced Andretti General Motors partnership that would bring the Cadillac name into F1 as a badging exercise. The Red Bull deal definitely represents a great bang-for-buck route into F1 for Ford. It requires far less commitment than starting a new works team, buying into an existing one, or building its own engine from scratch. Ford is not entering F1 in 2026 in the same way Audi is, yet it's still being welcomed with great fanfare. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially if it really is a middle ground between a fully fledged works operation and a jazzed up sponsor like Alfa Romeo has been in recent years. Ford will be part funding the project, and there seems to be a genuine belief it will be properly involved with the battery and energy recovery systems. Investing and contributing to the program would be a tangible involvement beyond just paying for a sticker or a name on the entry list. This means that it is accepted within F1 that there is no single way a manufacturer has to enter. There's wiggle room in what they're allowed to do. We already had a glimpse of that with F1 being totally at ease with Alfa Romeo paying Sauber for naming rights in a deal that allows Alfa to claim an F1 team that it really has nothing to do with. So it's inevitable that this has triggered thoughts along the lines of, if Ford can enter piggybacking onto someone else, why is Andretti's General Motors deal not good enough? We've covered the saga of that bid in depth already, but all you need to know here is that Andretti faces serious opposition, despite seemingly doing what was asked by going out and finding a manufacturer to partner with. One of the arguments against the Andretti bid is that it could just be smoke and mirrors, with General Motors simply blessing the use of one of its brand's names. Then Andretti can argue it will run as a works team with manufacturer backing to get onto the grid, while General Motors benefits from having an F1 team with minimal input. The opposition to that arrangement also contends that Andretti using a customer Renault engine and calling it a Cadillac would belittle the commitment from the real engine manufacturers. Still, you can probably see the alleged hypocrisy here. If people are really against letting in Andretti Cadillac because they doubt it would be a real General Motors works team, why is it okay for Ford to make a half-hearted manufacturer commitment of its own? If F1 and the FIA are genuinely open to expanding the grid for the right team or teams, then theoretically Ford's not quite full works program should be a good sign that a manufacturer doesn't have to have a majority stake in a team or make an arbitrary massive investment to be considered a serious prospect. Andretti and General Motors have found their own middle ground with their plan to enter an Andretti-run team in the name of a major US manufacturer. But there are a couple of key differences that underline the real problems facing Andretti and General Motors, and it's hard to tell whether they represent insurmountable hurdles. The biggest difference between what General Motors is trying to help Andretti achieve and how Ford is getting back into F1 is that Ford's backing an existing entity. Ford will be directly supporting a 2026 engine manufacturer in Red Bull powertrains and strengthening two existing franchises in Red Bull Racing and AlphaTauri. Agreeing to put its name to a startup engine project is quite different to General Motors badging a Renault engine that will carry on racing under its actual name with another team. Ford's presence in F1 will not involve an additional team that risks diluting the prize money pot or TV exposure for the existing teams. And it should be well understood by now that this is one of the key concerns over letting Andretti Cadillac be an 11th team, despite the fact that a process to find new entrants has now officially opened. So this is one very plain reason why Ford can be welcomed with open arms, but Andretti and Cadillac and General Motors are still trying to argue their case. But there's another factor too. It's not just that Ford's partnering with an existing team, it's that it's partnering with a very, very good team. The world champion, in fact. It remains an unspoken but obvious fact that senior figures within F1, in the championship and among the teams, have serious reservations over how good an Andretti-run team would be, and they make no secret of being put out by how they feel Michael Andretti has conducted himself by going about this so publicly. To Andretti supporters, any argument against the project comes across as either naively underestimating them or being disrespectful to such an esteemed racing family. Andretti's critics recognise the achievements of Mario and Michael in their racing careers and how prolific Andretti Autosport is in competing in so many categories. But it's Andretti's results that bring a question mark. The most relevant comparison is IndyCar, a championship Andretti Autosport hasn't won in a decade. But it's now considered only the fourth best team there, behind Penske, Ganassi and McLaren. This might sound plain ignorant of the quality of teams in IndyCar or the championship itself, but basically F1 figures are not at all convinced by Andretti's recent track record there. Plus, IndyCar features a spec chassis and a lot more spec parts than F1, where the team would have to do much more of its own work. So it remains a serious concern that Andretti may underestimate what is needed to be truly competitive in F1. The worst case scenario would be for Andretti to join the grid, struggle and potentially disappear again, which may mean a lot of upheaval and short-term compromises in F1 for ultimately nothing. Simply put, if you're wondering why the constant opposition to Andretti, or if you think there's some kind of hypocrisy behind F1 being okay with Ford but not GM or Cadillac, it's not quite as simple as no outsiders are welcome. The desire to be cautious and protect the existing entries is definitely a factor, but there are clearly specific issues holding Andretti back. If the Cadillac General Motors support goes beyond a badging deal, there's a compelling plan behind the team itself, and Andretti follows Ford's lead by conducting everything in private, there's still a real chance of this new entry getting the go-ahead. But there's also an inescapable implication that even the most basic General Motors blessed project would be welcomed with open arms if it was attached to another team.